Welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday on Al Arabiya News. I'm Rosanna Lockwood, coming up on the show. Hezbollah's leader says the group was dealt an unprecedented blow and the attacks could be called a declaration of war after 20 of its members and leaders were killed in explosions. As Israel bombs southern Lebanon overnight, targeting what it calls Hezbollah terrorist infrastructure sites, I speak to former ambassador of Lebanon, Tracy Chamoun, for her reaction. Lebanon's health ministry saying at least 37 people killed and some 2,931 wounded in this week's electronics explosions. And US Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Paris meeting with foreign ministers to discuss this latest situation in the Middle East. Escalation concerns indeed mounting in the Middle East, and a news conference earlier today, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah saying the group was dealt an unprecedented blow and the attacks could be called a declaration of war. The comments coming after Lebanon's health minister said the number of fatalities from both days of electronic explosions had reached at least 37, with more than 3,500 wounded. Overnight, the Israeli military targeting 6 so-called Hezbollah terrorist infrastructure sites and a weapons storage facility in southern Lebanon, hitting regions including Chamoun, Taib, Blida and others. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by Beirut-based journalist Hannah McCarthy. Hannah, thank you for making time. And let's start with the statement that was made earlier by Hassan Nasrallah. Was it pretty much in line with what was expected?
I think it is broadly in line with what we would have expected Nasrallah to say. I guess the last few speeches he made have maybe been a little bit underwhelming in terms of the response he was suggesting Hezbollah was going to make. But in this speech, he said, what has happened over the last few days obviously requires us to take a stand. So quite a strong statement from Hassan Nasrallah that there will be some sort of retaliation for the attacks across Lebanon that we saw this week. He also recognized the severity of the attack. He said we've received a hard and severe blow. And he also said that there's an investigation underway, and I'm sure Hezbollah will be looking carefully about how this could have happened, how their equipment could have been so compromised, and where was the weak link along the way.
Now, of course, no specificity about what that retribution could look like or that response. You wouldn't expect one. But in terms of what people are saying in Beirut, what is feared?
I think people are very much in a kind of wait and see mode. I was just in Dahieh about half an hour ago watching the beginning of the speech there. I think people were fairly calm watching the speech. I don't think there was a huge sense of anticipation that something dramatic is immediately going to happen. The cafes were full of pretty busy with people watching the speech, but I don't think there's a sense that there's going to be an immediate retaliation. I think there's a sense that it's going to take a bit of time for Hezbollah to regroup after this kind of attack.
And in terms of what the last 2 days have been like in Beirut, obviously a hardened city, used to dealing with a lot, but this series of coordinated explosions, I mean, it took the world by surprise and shock. It's grabbed headlines absolutely everywhere. What's it been like in Lebanon as people have digested what's happened?
I mean, it's been pretty frenetic over the past couple of days. I think around any hospital in Beirut, it's been chaos. Ambulances coming in and out, families waiting outside, waiting for news of their loved ones. But then again, as is almost the norm in Beirut, in other sections of the city, life is going on. Maybe the streets were a bit quieter, but in general, on one hand, life is going on, but on the other hand, for the hospital, certainly this was a massive event, and I think they're going to continue to be dealing with the outcome of these attacks, where people have been left with serious eye injuries, serious hand injuries for I'd say some weeks to come.
Hannah McCarthy, thank you very much for joining us. Well, what does this mean for wider relations in the Middle East? To answer that, I'm joined now by the former ambassador of Lebanon to the Kingdom of Jordan, who resigned following the Beirut port explosion, Tracy Chamoun. Thank you very much for making time for us. And almost sorry to ask this question, but it's the natural place to start. What are your concerns for Lebanon at the moment?
Well, right now, as we speak, I've just been following the news, and there's intense fighting in the south. Several raids, Israeli raids on many villages. And Hezbollah has fortified their positions down there. And I believe this morning there were quite a few Israeli soldiers that were killed. So I think that we're going to see now the next phase of the war, which is going to be very harsh for the south and for the population in the south.
How prepared is Lebanon in your mind for that?
Not at all. I mean, we've been really trying to put off this situation as much as possible diplomatically and even militarily. But it seems that it's become inevitable. We're not prepared at all. We're a country that's undergone a huge economic crisis. We don't have the facilities. Our hospitals, over the past few days have been inundated with victims. And so we have a great shortage of supplies, medical supplies. We're really not equipped to deal with a full-on war. But I think the war is going to be limited to the south. That's not good either. We have a huge population that's been displaced, as well as the Israelis. We have about 60,000 people displaced in Lebanon. So it's not looking good.
Look, Lebanon is a resilient country. Well, it's trying to be anyway. As you mentioned there, economic crisis, the Beirut port explosion, still in many people's memories, a state of almost perpetual conflict, certainly along the southern border. How much does that take the people, and how far can that take the government, the resilience?
Well, at this point, we don't have much choice in the matter, and we just have to make the best of a bad situation. Our government has got its hands tied somewhat because, we've also not been able to elect a president for 2 years. So it's a caretaker government. It's not even a fully fledged government to deal with this crisis situation. The whole thing is just, inept right now and not up to the level where we can handle a huge war.
Talking presidency, you previously tried a bid for presidency on a platform critical of Hezbollah. Talk to us about the existence of the group in Lebanon currently from your perspective.
Well, we've always had this problem of a armed group that's, semi-rogue and works within and without the establishment. And the idea was to regulate this and bring Hezbollah's arms into the chain of military command. But this was not possible. And any president today that's going to come to power has to look at a new defense strategy for Lebanon. And we have to see what the fallout is of this war that we're going to engage in now.
In terms of the immediate fallout, retribution has, of course, been vowed by Hezbollah for the events of this week, the coordinated pager and walkie-talkie explosions. What might that retribution or response look like?
Well, I think whereas before there was restraint, and I think that they were targeting military bases and sites and equipment, spy equipment, etc. I think that this time there's not going to be any restraints in terms of targeting soldiers and obviously the collateral damage that will come with that. So whereas before, they were trying to follow some kind of rules of engagement, I think that's going to change dramatically. And now it's becoming a fight for survival. So I think all the outcomes are possible.
Talk to me about your first impressions when you heard the news of the pager explosions on Tuesday, when you saw the pictures, when it became clear what was happening across Lebanon. What was your reaction?
Well, actually, I was there. I was traveling on the road in the southern suburbs that leads to the airport. I was actually coming back to the mountains, and you have to cross there. And so suddenly I was stuck in terrible traffic, and we could hear that there was chaos and commotion all around. And we were on a small overpass, and we looked down and we saw people lying on the ground and people scurrying and rushing and cars beginning to honk their horns to get people to move out of the way so that they could carry the victims. And I was stuck for about 2.5 hours in that maelstrom. And I could see many of the victims. They all passed in front of me. Some of them were being carted on motorcycles with their hands cut off, just bleeding. Another man had his eye gouged out. Another one had this whole side of his face ripped off. So it was very traumatic. And, having lived through 18 years of war, it certainly did trigger a lot of PTSD in me. But It was horrible. And I think when people talk about the pagers exploding, there's a sort of cynicism about it. Oh, it's just pagers exploding. But no, it's not. These pagers were actually rigged with explosives. And when they exploded, they caused severe damage, maimed people, blinded people, ripped their intestines out. It was real carnage. This is not something that is just, a small incident of pagers exploding and walkie-talkie exploding. It's really vicious and very damaging, and the people that were injured are going to be maimed for life. And I think that for Hezbollah, this was a huge blow, because in their tradition and in their religion, martyrdom is somewhat sacred and a source of pride to die for the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we're speaking now, Tracy, Hassan Nasrallah is making that statement. So we will, of course, respond to any of the lines that we get out of that as and when we hear them, and throughout our show. Look,
Right.
That aside, I want to first offer my condolences for the trauma that you experienced, as you mentioned there, on Tuesday. And thank you for recounting the experience to us for our viewers so they can get a sense of the impact of that. And along with that, of course, it was in civilian areas. Two children were killed in Tuesday's attacks. Children were injured as well. People are saying not just Hezbollah members, members of the public who are not associated with the group obviously got injured. There are a lot more broader dangers that could happen from that type of coordinated attack. There's analysis now that this will be constituted as a war crime, this type of attack. Do you think that could happen? Do you think that will be charged as a war crime?
Well, I think it's more of a terrorist act than a war crime, to be honest. It's a violation of Lebanese sovereignty, and it's an act of terror on our soil. It happens to target the Shia community, which today are labeled as Hezbollah. Not all of them are Hezbollah, but it's also targeting Lebanese. So, it's a terrorist act as far as I'm concerned, and it's a premeditated, deliberate terrorist act. If you think that, what's coming out now in the news is that these units, these communication units were rigged with explosives and designed to detonate and then sold to Hezbollah. Well, that's a whole different ballgame, and it's a hell of a diabolical plan and a very cruel and evil one.
And required months and months of planning, some are saying.
And required months of premeditated, organization, yes.
Absolutely. Some saying 5 months ago this would have had to be a disruption to the supply chain. So sort of sitting on this for a while before acting. Look, you had a role as an ambassador of Lebanon to the Kingdom of Jordan. So let's lean a bit more now on your diplomacy side of things and that expertise you can lend to us. Jordan's foreign minister, in fact, on Wednesday, saying that Israel is pushing the whole Middle East to the brink of regional conflict. This was their words, by maintaining a dangerous escalation on several fronts. You know the country well and the ministers there. What did you make of that statement?
This is absolutely correct. When you see what's happening also in the West Bank, that puts Jordan in a lot of danger and raises a lot of red flags as far as they're concerned. Israel has really been the one who's provoking. I know people say Hezbollah has been firing, rockets into the north. Well, Hezbollah has taken a position that they are a support front for what's happening in Gaza. And they have outlined the solution very clearly. They've said from the start to any diplomat that's visited Lebanon, when there is a ceasefire in Gaza and a complete cessation of hostilities, there will be a ceasefire on the northern front. It's contingent on a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, there are people who do not want a ceasefire in Gaza, primarily the Israeli prime minister, for personal reasons. And I'm not saying anything new. His people even say this, that to stay in power, he needs to feed the war machine. And on the other hand, you've got Hamas, who has no interest as well in having a ceasefire, because the Palestinian issue has suddenly become a global issue. And if there's a ceasefire, then there's going to be reckoning. Hamas's objective is to drag everybody into a larger war to be vindicated and to have their cause defended, even though in an indirect way, and even though by causing chaos, in the whole region. So you have two players that really don't want a ceasefire. And that's why we've not been able to stop the fighting in Lebanon. If there was a ceasefire, if Biden's plan had been, practiced and abided by, then we could have ended the hostilities on the northern border. It's as simple as that.
In terms of the US and their role in this, do you feel they've been trying? Marks for trying, but do you feel like it's at all been listened to? Do you feel like the impact of the US in the Middle East is there as it once was?
Well, I think you have a will to stop the fighting, but not the ability to impose it. I think the US is in a difficult position because, they're one of the biggest arms suppliers to Israel, and it's very hard to stop selling weapons. So you also have, the Jewish lobby in Israel, which is very powerful. And I know from my son who lives in the States, that the news that reaches America is not necessarily the news that we experience here.
In terms of diplomatic channels that could still be used with Israel, do you feel like there are members of the government there that are open to diplomacy?
I think everybody's been open to diplomacy. The only people who've not been open to diplomacy are the Israelis. They've been trying. The Americans, Amos Hochstein, the special presidential envoy, has been shuttling backwards and forwards with trying to come up with solutions for the South, knowing full well that it's tied into the front in Gaza. And he hasn't really been able to. Now, there is this UN Resolution 1701, which dates back to 2005, 2006, during the previous Israeli war that we had with Hezbollah, which basically stipulates the disarmament of all militias on the border, and also stops and bans Israel from doing flyovers. Now, Israel's been in violation of that resolution for decades. When Israel bombs Syria, it flies over Lebanon to bomb Syria. Today, Israel flew over Lebanon twice and broke the sound barrier, and the windows in my house nearly shattered. So neither party really wants to adopt a diplomatic solution because it would curtail their military ambitions. And so at this point, it's very difficult to come up with a solution. As I said, the main one really ties into Gaza. It ties into a cessation of hostilities and a ceasefire in Gaza, and a solution for the Palestinian problem, which obviously is completely vague at this point and has not been formulated nor clarified by anyone. I mean, there is complete destruction and no future envisaged for these poor people, where to go and how to cope with the fallout of the recent massacres that took place.
Yeah, we've been speaking elsewhere in the show about this, obviously the situation in Gaza is nowhere near ceasefire resolution or anything of the sort, and the onslaught does continue there as well. But all the attention and all the military focus has seemingly been kind of redirected this week, if indeed Israel is behind what's currently going on in Lebanon. They haven't officially claimed that they have, but everyone is saying that it was them. In terms of this being a new phase of the war, how do you think that is part of their strategy regards Gaza?
Well, I think Gaza is now on a slow burn. I mean, every day you have 40 people killed practically. So whatever the plan is that they're implementing, they're still carrying it out in Gaza, but they're trying to appease their population in the north. It's time to go back to school and people want to return to their homes, and the prime minister and his cabinet is under a lot of pressure to return the population to their northern habitat. Unfortunately, they don't realize that an escalation in war is not going to facilitate that. It's just going to take longer. And also they're talking about this buffer zone, this 10-kilometer buffer zone in Lebanon. Now, why should it be in Lebanon? Why should we lose 10 kilometers of our territory, for the sake of the Israelis going back to their homes? It's also a threat to the long-term exploitation of our oil and gas. If Israel occupies that territory, then it jeopardizes that. So there are many considerations as to why that buffer zone is not a good idea for the Lebanese. But the Israelis seem to feel that if they can get a 10-kilometer buffer zone, that they can protect their citizens and have them return to the north. But this is not feasible. 10 kilometers is nothing when you've got ballistic missiles, when you've got underground tunnel system that reaches right into Israel practically. It's not going to make any difference. The only solution, the only viable solution going forward is a diplomatic one. And they have to realize this, and they will probably realize this, but there will be a lot of casualties and a lot of deaths in the meantime, unfortunately.
A few more dimensions to that buffer zone than I think a lot of people are aware of. Look, just rounding things up in terms of support from elsewhere in the world, the international community. Pretty much everyone has tried to have a say in what's happening in Gaza. It'd be remiss of any, for example, European or UK government not to say they were somehow trying to get things sorted and supporting. In terms of support for Lebanon, do you feel out on your own, or do you feel like you have got support?
We've had tremendous support, and we continue to have support. We're just in a catch-22 situation, and it's really linked to the fate of Gaza. And it has been from the start. And there's no way that Hezbollah is going to back down from that position. So until there is a solution in Gaza, there's not going to be a solution in Lebanon.
It's been very good speaking to you, former ambassador of Lebanon to the Kingdom of Jordan, author and political analyst pretty much these days, Tracy Chamoun. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers,
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
join me on the Rizkan Show for empowering conversation.
Let's now speak to Professor Elias Warrak, an ophthalmologist at the Mount Lebanon University Hospital in Beirut. Sir, thank you for making time with us on a very long, I'm sure, and very busy day, dealing with a lot of trauma patients from these coordinated explosives attacks across Lebanon. Talk to us about what you've been dealing with.
Well, honestly, for the past 2.5 days, it was one of the worst nightmares, not only for me, but I mean, for most of the medical teams in Beirut, in Lebanon. We have received a huge number of casualties, and unfortunately, we couldn't save the organs that we are trained to save. I can talk as far as ophthalmology is concerned. Basically, we have seen a lot of cases where we have really badly damaged eyes. And in most of those cases, we couldn't save at least one of the two eyes. We had to remove a big number of eyes because they are heavily traumatized, and most of the eyes are really shattered. But we did our best to try to save as much as we can.
What, we're certain of that, and again, our condolences for dealing with such a traumatic day. I know you're a professional at this. In terms of your professional career, how does this compare? You must have dealt with conflict and trauma injuries in the past.
Well, actually, those 2 days, they reminded us of the bad days of the civil war in Lebanon, like 25 years ago. We had some bad cases, but I believe nothing to compare with these 2 days, because most of the casualties, they have been badly hit in the eyes, in the hands, and some in the abdomen. And the problem is that most of the ocular injuries, they are devastating, where most of the eyes, like I said, they are badly shattered, so we couldn't really reconstruct the eye. And unfortunately, some of those young men in their 20s, we were obliged to even eviscerate both eyes, to remove both eyes. So really, it was very hard to take those decisions. But ultimately, we did our best to try to save at least one of the eyes of those casualties.
So a lot of young men blinded by these explosions. A question that's being asked regularly from people not in Lebanon looking at this story from the outside is, why were eyes such an issue here? Why so many people were being blinded? What happened in that moment that caused there to be so many eye injuries?
Because I believe probably they received messages on their pagers, and whenever they take the pager and just to try to read the message, it seems that the pager will blow off. So that's why the damage is basically to the hands and to the face. Unfortunately, the damage is really quite big to the face, where like I said, the eyes are badly hit, some of the facial structures also, they are badly hit, like the mouth, the nose, sometimes the ear, and some of the patients, they have penetrating injury even to the brain.
In terms of there being a second night of explosions then, you know, there was talk of this first wave of pager explosions on Tuesday having been done early because there was a sense that Hezbollah were aware of what was happening and that it was going to be part of some bigger coordinated attack. And then on Wednesday night, walkie-talkies also exploding. Did you see more injuries then coming into your clinic, into your hospital because of the second day?
Actually, not as bad as the first day. It seems that some of those pagers, they were detected, and it seems they were isolated, so they don't do the damage to the holder of these pagers. But definitely, it was much less than the first day.
In terms of the range of people, you've mentioned young men in their 20s. Were there anybody else? We know, of course, that 2 children lost their lives on that first day, but did you treat anybody who was maybe else a nearby civilian?
Actually, the number of the nearby people were much less than those who were carrying on the pagers.
Talk to me about your preparations for something like this. Lebanon is a country that's dealt with a lot of conflict. You mentioned the civil war. There was a long, long time ago. You're saying that this is almost, you know, on a level with that in terms of the injuries you're seeing. As a hospital, are you prepared to deal with injuries like this at this volume?
Well, actually, the healthcare system in Lebanon is, like I said, it's quite resilient because we've been through so many wars, we've been through so many crises. Last but not least, the explosion of the port of Beirut. Basically, and this really what has helped in order to really manage this big number of casualties. I'm sure that all of these patients, they were taken care into the operating rooms. So no one was left out, I mean, in the emergency room or at the regular floor. We've been working for the past 3 days, almost 24 hours a day. So all the surgical teams, all the medical teams, all the paramedical teams, they are kind of fused to those kind of casualties. But, you know, like I said, the main difference here is that 90% of those casualties, they have really repetitively the same areas that are damaged, mostly the eyes, the face, the hands.
In terms of any further attacks that might happen, you know, nobody wants to see that happening, but as a hospital, you have to think about it, you have to prepare for that. How prepared do you feel?
Well, as you know, I mean, the outline that have been done and have been implemented over the past couple of months in all the hospitals in Lebanon in general and Beirut in specific, they're dealing with all kind of scenarios that can happen. We hope we will not need to go through those scenarios, but basically all the scenarios of war, they have been elucidated, they have been dealt with, they have been really explained to all the staff that is present in all hospitals, specifically in the university hospitals.
How are you and your, I mean, the preparedness aside, the equipment, the training, and all of that, it's so important. But in terms of how you cope with something like this, you're talking about highly traumatic injuries. You're all very much trained to do this. But of course, there's plenty of evidence now that people do get traumatized. There is a side effects of this from the medical professionals. How do you and your staff cope?
Excuse me, I lost you for the last sentence.
Of course, Professor, I was just asking in terms of preparedness of medical equipment and training aside, how do you and your staff cope with dealing with such traumatic injuries?
Well, basically, other than the psychological effect on the casualties and, you know, the traumatic or the trauma to the families and to all the relatives of the casualties, we have special teams that they deal specifically with this kind of scenarios. So they really explain to the parents, they know how to explain to the relatives, and especially when you have cases of casualties that they end up losing their lives, unfortunately, or in cases of casualties where they lost major organs. like I said, like if they lose their hands, if they lose their legs, or they lose their eyes. So definitely they have been trained how to talk to the parents. They are trained how to talk to the relatives of the patients. And this is what have been going on, I mean, for quite a while.
Talk to us about what the last 2 days have been like for you in terms of how you've been managing the workload. Have you slept at all?
Well, honestly, for the first day, when we had the biggest number of casualties, we went to bed probably somewhere around 5 in the morning. The second day, we had personally, I slept like in 2 a.m. and now I'm just getting out of the operating room when Mike just called me.
Yeah, that's our producer, Mike, you're referencing there, because we were very keen to speak to you here on Al Arabiya News to find out exactly how you've been dealing with all of this and you know, your thoughts about it all. And I do want to ask you, just as a Lebanese person here, somebody living, working, residing in Lebanon, what are your concerns going forward, hospital aside, but just for the country?
Well, honestly, for the past 5 years, I mean, we've been under so much pressure because we have so many repetitive crises, starting with the COVID, then moving into the financial crisis, then the explosion of the port of Beirut, and now the war since it started in Gaza, and it has expanded to some areas of the region. And last but not least, the things that we're dealing with over the past couple of days. So definitely those repetitive crises, it's not easy to deal with. We're trying to be resilient as much as we can. And the good thing about the healthcare system of Lebanon is that most of our doctors who had to leave for some financial issues, most of them, they are working as part-timers in Lebanon. So they leave for a couple of weeks and then they come back to their hospitals in Beirut or in other areas in Lebanon. So till now, I mean, we are able to deal, let's say, with these recurrent crises. Hopefully, it will come to an end soon enough, and I hope that this ugly war will not really expand to become a regional war, because definitely, in that scenario, things will be much worse.
We thank you very much for sharing those words with us, sharing your experience with us. We'll let you get back to your important work at hand. Professor Elias Warrak, ophthalmologist at Mount Lebanon University Hospital in Beirut.
Thank you very much for having me.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers,
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
join me on the Resigned show for empowering conversation.
Well, in a news conference earlier today, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah saying the group was dealt a, quote, unprecedented blow, and the attacks could be called a declaration of war. For reaction to that, I'm joined now by Professor David Tal, an expert on Israel's security and diplomatic history. Sir, let's talk first about Israel being behind this. They haven't officially claimed responsibility. They've sort of inferred in maybe some statements in the last 24 hours, but unlikely to ever claim official responsibility. Do you think they did do the coordinated attacks across pages and walkie-talkies?
Well, I think it sounds very reasonable, and the common guess is that Israel is behind it. And while Israel did not confirm, it, on the other hand, did not really deny that it was standing behind that. So I think it will be quite a sensible risk to assume that Israel is behind the attack.
Yeah, and I get that you're sizing up the likelihood that it was indeed them. Per my question, you're saying it's sensible and reasonable as an assumption in terms of as a mode of strategy for Israel right now, entering what they're calling a new phase of the war. Clearly got military ambitions regarding displaced people in the north, as well as what's currently going on in Gaza. The attacks this week, these extraordinary attacks on pagers and walkie-talkies, do you think it was a coherent strategy?
It's very difficult to say. It's very difficult to say because many commentators in Israel are asking that question, because it would make sense to have such an attack if it was coming together with broader attack on an all-out attack on the Hezbollah. It should be the first step toward an all-out attack. Then it would make sense. It would be kind of part of broader strategy. As it is right now, it is a kind of a standalone act, which it's very difficult to say where it should lead and what is I would say, the strategic goal behind that. In tactical, as a tactical act, it was quite brilliant. But the question is, where does it lead Israel and the Hezbollah? And whether Israel really intends to take the next step, that is to go to war, to an all-out war with the Hezbollah. It is not completely clear that it is the case. On the other hand, there are those who assume that what Israel was at least hoped to achieve by that is kind of to serve as a deterrent toward the Hezbollah, to say, look, we achieved that, we did that, and we might, let's stop here because our next move might be much more painful. So it's really difficult to place that within a very coherent strategy and to see and to understand exactly what were the Israeli broader intentions if Israel was behind this attack.
Yeah, as you say there's multiple strategies that could be at play. Disabled the communications network of Hezbollah. Well, anyway, the hand devices of them. You struck fear, not you personally, obviously Israel. I'm talking about here, striking fear and chaos, if indeed it was them behind it, amongst the ranks of Hezbollah, blinding some, maiming others, really causing chaos and striking fear, probably. But surely calculating a strategic response from Hezbollah, but also the wider concern of an Iranian retaliation elsewhere or somehow. What do you think that could look like?
Well, this is exactly the problem, really, in evaluating this attack and the meaning of this attack. Now, one assumption is that Israel was forced in a way to carry out the attack right now because there were rumors that Hezbollah operatives started to suspect. They probably saw something that led them to suspect that something is wrong with their devices. So Israel had to make a very quick choice, either to allow the Hezbollah to reveal the whole scheme, the whole thing, or to act immediately. That is to act not when Israel would deem it right time to act. But again, we don't really know. What we do know is that this attack was not the first stage of an all-out Israeli attack. As you said, it blinded the Hezbollah, not only the single persons who got blinded, but also the whole, or most of the Hezbollah get blinded, was a lot of havoc, a lot of chaos. And Israel did not use that chaos in order really to strike forcefully the Hezbollah. And now the question is, what will be the reaction of the Hezbollah? And the reaction of the Hezbollah, I don't think that Iran will take kind of a warlike measure against Israel. Another problem is that if Hezbollah would go to an all-out war against Israel, that might lead to the loss of a very significant strategic asset of Iran, because Iran is treating Hezbollah as part of its arm. And I'm not sure if Iran right now want to use that arm. So it's really, with that attack, all cards, I would say, got all kind of rearranged, and it's very difficult to tell where it will take us, where we are going to go from here.
In terms of Israel potentially acting early on this, by which I mean the pager explosions on Tuesday, there was analysis that obviously it had been a long-planned attack by whoever launched it, and it was supposed to be the first move in a series of moves. But potentially they may have been pushed to do it sooner because Hezbollah had intelligence about the planned operation. Do you buy that as an argument?
As I said, yeah, it can be. Once again, the real issue is that we don't know. We don't really know what was behind the timing of this attack. Not to say that we don't know who was behind that attack, but we certainly don't know what was behind the timing. We don't see what you might suspect was supposed to be the next stage, that is an all-out attack by Israel, taking advantage of the chaos that really swept all over the Hezbollah. So, yeah, you are right. We are at the stage really standing and looking and trying to understand what's going on. Right now, Israel is bombing south of Lebanon, but these bombings did not exceed beyond what was taking place along that front from October the 8th. So as it looks like at this point, this is a standalone attack. It is quite painful. It's quite harmful to the Hezbollah. But as it is right now, it looks like it is a standalone attack, and Israel might kind of would say, look, we won't go beyond that, and we expect the Hezbollah not to drag us to an all-out war. But of course, this is no longer in the hands of Israel. It's now in the hands of the Hezbollah.
It is indeed. And you know what? It's sometimes hard to keep track with the months in between when retribution is vowed, assassinations, we're talking coordinated attacks, and then when and how that retribution gets delivered and where, because there's multiple issues going on at the moment with Gaza, with Lebanon, and then you've got Iran supposedly involved from behind. So in terms of keeping track when the retribution arrives and what it was retribution for is always something interesting to consider. In terms of the US, if you don't mind, we'll talk about that because Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Cairo when these attacks pretty much were launched across Lebanon and some people in Syria as well on Tuesday. He was asked, were you aware of this? Was the US aware of this? If it was Israel behind it, did they inform you? And the US saying, no, they were not aware of this. Do you also buy that argument?
Well, first, I wouldn't expect Blinken to say otherwise, in any case. That is first. Second, the coordination, the strategic military coordination between Israel and the United States is very deep, is very strong, it's very continuous. On the other hand, that very specific attack, maybe Israel did not really inform or did not really share with the United States all the details of these attacks, if only because of fear of leakage. And there is always the issue of that it was a bit of premature in the sense that Israel did not really want to carry out this attack right now, and it had to do that because fearing that the Hezbollah would expose the whole thing. So Israel acted quite swiftly and quickly without having even the time to coordinate that with the United States. But I would assume that at a certain level, the United States was informed. I'm not sure if it was informed about the details. It might be informed about general intention to carry out such an attack or something like that. And certainly Israel informed the United States after act about what Israel did and why Israel did that.
And of course, we can't forget, and I quite agree, you wouldn't expect necessarily to hear confirmation that somebody was made aware of a covert intelligence operation from someone else in a press conference. But there is, of course, politics at play. There's a US election coming up. I think it's about 45 days from now, up in November. Israel-Gaza forming a big part of the way voters are thinking and the way candidates are talking about foreign policy, US foreign policy as well. So in terms of the way that Blinken had to respond to that question and the way the current Biden administration is handling this, how much of this is factoring in them seeing Israel as an ally and talking about whether or not they were aware of the operation?
The United States would not confirm in any case, even if Israel informed the United States every single detail of this attack. The United States, no one in the United States, and regardless of elections, regardless of every contemporary event, this is something that you won't share with anyone, that kind of information, not before, not after, certainly if Israel denied or Israel did not confirm that. But this is also quite a sensitive time. Although I'm not sure if the elections and Israel placing these elections is not a bit exaggerated. The Israelis are really, and not only Israelis, many think that Israel plays a significant role in the American elections. I'm not sure if Israel is that significant factor. It is, and the conflict and the war are factors, but I'm not sure if they are that important and significant factors. But in any case, it's quite obvious that no one in the United States would do something before Israel would say something about this attack.
Look, you're an expert on Israel's diplomatic history, and we're speaking elsewhere in the show with a former ambassador, Lebanese ambassador to the Kingdom of Jordan, about diplomacy efforts and what can be secured in terms of stepping away from coordinated military attacks, surprise attacks, wars, bombings, things like that. Is there any hope at the moment for diplomacy channels within the current Israeli government?
This is the question that you ask is a kind of an opening to a discussion that I'm not sure that you have enough time to have, because part of the problem really is that I'm quite sure that if there was right now a diplomatic offer that would lead, for example, to the complete withdrawal of the Hezbollah beyond the Litani line, beyond the Israeli borders, and the Hezbollah would put down its arms, I'm quite sure that the Israeli government would take that. Israel is not Israel has no interest in really going into a complete an all-out war with the Hezbollah. On the other hand, there are Israeli domestic political issues that some would assume that are also behind the continuous, I would say, belligerency of Israel at that point. There are those who suspect the Israeli prime minister that his motives are not completely caring about security and about diplomatic solution, but more about the preservation of his government, of his rule. And these considerations might dictate a more militant policy that would better serve Israel. It is not clear that the calculations of the prime minister right now are the best for the security of Israel and the region. However, as I said, these are speculations. And I really, as you said, I'm an expert of Israeli diplomatic history. That means that I can tell a lot about the past. I'm not that familiar with what happens in the future. So it's very difficult really to say something definite about that. But I would say that if there was a concrete and significant diplomatic document on the table that would satisfy Israel demands as they are put now, that is, that will allow Israel to bring back its citizens into their back homes in the north of Israel, would remove the Hezbollah from the border, would lead to the Hezbollah putting down its arms. I'm quite confident that Israel would sign on such a document.
Interesting. And look, I really hear your point, Professor David Tal, about answering such a huge question in a brief news talk show format, and appreciate your efforts to do so. I think it's just that the perception from the outside, from the events of the last week and indeed of the last year, is that there seems to be more of an sort of impact and more effort going in militarily than potentially diplomatically. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I don't think it's assessment. I think this is the reality. The question is why that is the reality. Is it because either Israel or the Hezbollah failed and are failing the diplomatic efforts? There is an American envoy who is now shuttling between Israel, the United States, and Lebanon, who is trying to reach an agreement. Who is to be blamed for the failure of that American emissary? Is it Israel? Is it Lebanon? Is it the Hezbollah? We don't know. We really don't know. It's very difficult to say. So the reality is exactly as you described. This is a reality where military actions dominate the diplomatic activities. But the success of diplomacy is depend also to a great extent on the will of the two parties. And who is the party who fails these negotiations? I think it's quite early to say right now.
We appreciate you making an effort, though, to speak to us and try and explain to us in this brief format. Professor David Tal, expert on Israel security and diplomatic history. Thank you.
Thank you.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake, and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers,
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Well, I'm joined now by the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, retired CIA paramilitary operations officer from the Special Activities Center, and former US Marine Infantry officer Mick Mulroy. Mick, speaking to us from New York, we appreciate it. Given your perspective and your vast experience as well in the Middle East region, how bad are things looking right now to you?
So, Rosanna, this is of course, the third and fourth successful covert operation that was likely done by Mossad, the intelligence service of Israel, and special units inside the IDF. It is, from that perspective, successful in the sense that they've likely really reduced confidence from the Hezbollah fighters in their leadership, their supply chain of command, and of course, their communication structure. There is, of course, concern that it would also give Hezbollah even more reason to want to significantly respond to Israel, and they have the capacity to do so with over 150,000 missiles and rockets. And of course, we still haven't seen a response from Iran for the attack, for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. So it certainly does increase tensions, but I think from the statements of the IDF that this is another phase of the war that they consider, and they expect it to increase tensions.
There's a lot for us to pick up on from that. A good overview, thank you. In terms of you saying Mossad behind this, pretty much everyone is, reports around the world, media in Israel itself. But will we ever see Mossad claim direct responsibility?
Well, generally speaking, you never claim a covert action. It's just not in the nature of the very type of operation that it is. So I think it's clear from the statements, both of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, that it was Israel. And this is the type of operation that Mossad would lead, even if elements of the IDF were a part of it. And it's clear that it was done based on intelligence. I mean, I think it's likely that the Hezbollah fighters were told to stay off cell phones. They are problematic from a counterintelligence perspective, from their perspective. And then Israel knew that they were moving to these pagers, which are very unique and very specific, and most people don't use them anymore. So they likely got into the chain of command, or excuse me, into the supply chain and inserted these explosives. And it was something that, I think you have to look at both sides from a military covert side or intel side, successful, but there's questions about how they ensured, if they did at all, that they weren't standing next to innocent civilians at the time they were detonated, which of course is a requirement under international law. But this is, from a military intel perspective, something that they really intended, I believe, to shake the confidence in the Hezbollah fighters in their entire command structure.
There has been a lot of commentary in the last 24 hours that this could indeed constitute a war crime because of the way that these communications devices were ostensibly hacked into and activated at the same time in civilian areas. Do you think there will be that type of inquiry, those types of charges leveled?
Well, when it comes to the law of that governs this, the international law, proportionality is important. In other words, if you have a valid military target, that has to be the first part of it. If it's not valid, then of course it is a war crime. But even if it is, every nation has a duty to avoid civilian casualties the best they can. And that's the question. Obviously, you'd have to know the facts around this, but you could see that there would be an investigation to that effect, as these individuals, just like individuals that carry pagers around the world, are with their families or with children. They're in they're taxis. They could even be in airplanes, right? If it was low enough that the signal to the pager could be reached. So I'm sure that it will be looked at. There's also, of course, a lot of the activities in Gaza that will be looked at. And I think it's every nation's responsibility to ensure they follow the law of international conflicts. But that is something that would have to be investigated to make a determination.
The series of explosions amongst pagers and then walkie-talkies and the way it was coordinated and carried out has been described by world media as interchangeably audacious, extraordinary. Some infer that to mean some sort of positive thing, but really it's sort of unprecedented from what we're hearing in terms of the way these were hacked into and the decision to detonate them like this. When you first heard news of this happening 2 days ago, what was your initial response?
Well, certainly from an operational perspective, this is impressive. I mean, to be able to do this, to get you're basically targeting an entire army individually. And I think from the Israeli perspective, they would say they did it in a way that actually reduced the chance of any civilian collateral damage. But the operation itself was certainly impressive and large in scope. It's likely they knew, I'm guessing, I don't know this, of course, for sure, but once the pagers were obviously compromised with the detonations, that Hezbollah would then switch to their other form of communication, which wouldn't be cell phones, but would be handheld radios. So it might have been sequenced out to do this way. So they would get a maximum effect from both manipulation of the pagers and the handheld push-to-talk radios.
And of course, we again can't know for sure, but there was plenty of speculation after the pager explosions on Tuesday that if it was indeed Mossad, if it was indeed Israel, they'd been pushed to act earlier than they had hoped because there was maybe a chance that Hezbollah operatives were getting wise to their scheme. Do you think that is likely?
I do. I think they would have rather waited until if there really is going to be a ground conflict component to the war in the north, which many think unfortunately will be the case, it would have been better served if they held this until right at the time of that actual incursion. That would completely disrupt their communications. And when it comes to an army trying to stop a force like the IDF coming in, a crippling of the communications would have been a crippling of their ability to fight coordinated manner. So I think they would have held off till that. So it's likely that they thought they were compromised and they were either going to do it now or it wouldn't have been an option in the future. That seems to be the logical explanation.
Indeed, there are concerns of a ground conflict. No one, again, can know for sure. Lebanon on the edge at the moment. What would it look like, do you think?
Well, to start with, I think everybody in the region and the world, for that matter, should not want to see this conflict. I think from Israel's perspective, they have 50,000 plus people that are displaced from the north, and they find that unacceptable. And they are going to do what they need to do, according to them, in public statements to ensure that they can go back to their place of residence. And that's going to mean, I think, pushing Hezbollah to the Litani River, which is what the UN mandate or the UN resolution mandates. From Hezbollah's perspective, they, I don't think, want a war, but they also can't just concede the territory for their own political issues. So if this happens, it's going to be devastating, I think, of course, to Lebanon and also Israel, because the Hezbollah capacity is much greater than Hamas. They have, as we already talked about, over 150,000 missiles and rockets, and many of them are precision guided. And if they use them in mass, even with the capabilities of the Iron Dome, which is the Israeli air missile defense, you could overwhelm it, and they could hit the grids, they could hit the power grids, the communications grids, and obviously civilian population centers. And if that happens, then this war is going to escalate even further, likely bring in Iran, and that's a regional conflict that nobody should want to see. It's also important to note that Israel did do a lot of mitigation and degrading of Hezbollah's capabilities, if you remember those series of airstrikes. But they certainly didn't get them all, and that this is going to be a sizable fight if it happens, and certainly on the ground.
Again, a lot to pick up on there, but we'll talk first about Israel's aims for its displaced residents in the north, as you've picked up on. They came out with a statement just hours before the pager explosions on Tuesday, saying that a goal of what they're calling the current war is to get those displaced residents back, and that would happen to be militarily, probably. Do you think what's happened with these series of coordinated explosions in the last 2 days has got them closer to or further from that goal?
So military sequencing, I think this would be the first, operational preparation of the battlefield is what we call it, which is really softening the target. And obviously, if they can't communicate effectively, and now they won't trust their communications even if they replace them, that is one way to do it. And from my perspective, speaking to the Israelis and seeing their public comments, it's pretty clear that they at least intend the world to believe that this is going to happen. It's not a if, it's a when it's going to happen. And I think that needs to be noted by the rest of the world, because this can certainly spiral out of control. But this is either going to happen from Israel's perspective by force, or voluntarily Hezbollah withdraw to the UN designated line, which is above the Litani River. This could happen. If it does happen, the United States could also be pulled into this. It's important to point out. The Israelis have the capacity to defend themselves, but if they are attacked by both Iran, and we saw in April how substantial that could be, Hezbollah, and even the Houthis, it may require the United States, at least from an air component, to help degrade the threats, which it could include direct airstrikes on the ground in Lebanon, for example.
I'll come to the US shortly, because I think it has obviously an important role to play in all of this in terms of mediation. In terms of the strategy of fear or chaos in and of itself, do you think that has been part of the strategy? So enough chaos within Hezbollah that maybe they won't even respond?
Yes, I think that has been part of the strategy. There have been, almost daily strikes, including special operations raids to go after, and hopefully from their perspective, decapitate the leadership. And I think that has sown a great deal of concern all the way up to Nasrallah, and certainly within the ranks. And that's exactly what they intend to do. And we haven't seen really that substantial of a response, even to the killing of their senior leader in Beirut, the assassination there, which, you would think they would have had more of a substantial response. So that might either be because Israel degraded that capability before it happened, or they really don't want to see this spiral out of control either. But they are in a position now where they probably feel politically they have to do more than just launch rockets into Israel. They're going to have to do something after this large-scale attack, thousands of casualties against their force across the board.
That is a really salient point about the vowed retribution, but again, it's sort of never arrived, that previous assassination. In terms of Iran and how they might be playing all of this, you've mentioned that already, but are they going to be seeking containment now, or some sort of smart retribution?
It's a very good question. So right now it looks like containment, because the idea was that Iran wasn't going to retaliate during the ceasefire negotiations, so they didn't look like the spoiler. But since those have seemed to go nowhere, there's not really a reason for Iran, from their perspective, to not strike in retaliation of the assassination. So if that hasn't happened, there's a potential, and this is something Iran likes. They like the gray space, if you will, which is more of a clandestine attack against Israel somewhere else. And of course, that was what led to the assassination. It was more of a covert operation than an overt operation like we saw in April, with missiles and drones in the hundreds launched at Israel. So that might be what's being developed right now. Hopefully it doesn't happen, of course, but that might be what Iran's looking at for retaliation. And if they hadn't had anything planned, it does take a while to set those up. But we don't know that, and we'll find out it's unlikely, in my experience, that Iran won't do anything in retaliation for what was clearly an embarrassment during their presidential inauguration events for have one of their guests, assassinated.
Look, let's talk about the US now, because Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has been on a bit of a tour over the past week. He was in Cairo talking about trying to secure efforts to try and sort of further ceasefire discussions for Gaza when all of this started happening. He's now, I believe, in Paris. In terms of the statements coming out of the US, what have you made of those so far? Do you see them having a role in being able to get the tensions de-escalated?
Well, I'd start with commending them for effort. I mean, I know that doesn't get you a lot of credit on the world stage, but it's clear that Secretary Blinken, Director Burns, for example, have put a considerable amount of effort into this, as well as the components from Qatar and Egypt. But I think when it comes to the statements of the U.S., they have been a bit optimistic in the past. And, although I'm sure that was partly an effort to use in negotiations, it really does give them a lower bit of credibility when it comes to where we are in these ceasefire negotiations. I don't think anybody's taking anybody's comments of how close we are. I think now it's either agreement or not an agreement. And I unfortunately don't see the two parties, the only two parties that matter, which is Hamas and Israel, getting closer. It seems to be, from the Israeli perspective, from Prime Minister Netanyahu, he'd like to see this continue, and he's not interested in a ceasefire. And Hamas is not interested in a ceasefire that isn't a permanent ceasefire. And that seems to be a sticking point of which neither side is willing to budge on. And every other part of it is just talking around the margins. So hopefully everybody should hope that we get a ceasefire. We need to see all the hostages released. And we also need to see relief brought to the civilians of Gaza, which is a very desperate situation on the humanitarian front. And the only way really to get there is to have a ceasefire.
Look, it is an ongoing and terrible situation. And then the world's attention has been moved this week from there up towards the situation that's happening in Lebanon. Do you think that is part of Israel's strategy? Because at the moment they're fighting wars on many fronts, and they're going to have to be thinking about those resources and also where attention goes. It must be part of the strategy, right?
I think so. And even when they're talking about this in phases, it's either exactly what they did plan, or they want the impression to be that these wars are completely connected. If they finish Hamas, or it's just part of the phasing of fighting back against what is the Iranian proxies ultimately, both in Hamas and Hezbollah. And so I think from their perspective, if the world focuses on the north, they will continue their operations in Gaza, but it will be a broad expansion. And I think from the IDF perspective, there is concern that they're not overstretched. It's easy for politicians to talk and to launch into new arenas, but ultimately it's the military that has to deal with all these political decisions, and that's why I think you're seeing the tension between the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister. The Minister of Defense being a retired Major General, so he knows of which he talks, and it might not be that there's an issue with conducting an attack against Hezbollah, but there is a part of that's reality, and that's the capacity of the IDF to do both. And I think that's where you're seeing the tension between the two individuals.
Former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Mick Mulroy, it's been very good to speak to you. Thank you.
Very good to speak to you.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews and debate. Until then, goodbye.